Muthoki Mumo is the Sub-Saharan Africa representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. In the last year, can you give me an encapsulated idea as to where in Sub-Saharan Africa journalist freedoms have improved and where they have gotten worse?
Unfortunately, it's a bit of a complicated answer to that question because it's difficult to say there's one country where we're seeing an overall improvement and another country where we're seeing an overall deterioration of press freedom. Instead, what we're seeing is some indicators changing. So, for instance, we're seeing countries where we noted some journalists who were imprisoned last year, as at December, for example, having freed those journalists. Just by my latest count, I found that we had seen journalists who were in prison in December 2019 being free in at least 7 countries. But while that indicator might indicate is showing an improvement, we're seeing these countries also, again, detaining new journalists. Now, in other countries, we're seeing, when we look at other indicators like the law or where the judiciary stands, an example that I might give of this sort of contrast is Tanzania, where we saw the courts come out and say a really repressive media law was not in keeping with Tanzania's regional commitments to good governance. But then, so that we might consider to be an improvement. But then at the same time, we see a country where journalists, again, are still being arrested, where the government itself is not complying with court orders to change laws that are problematic. So I'm sorry to say it's sort of a mixed bag. We see some indicators getting better, but we see also regression in other places.
What has been the situation for journalists in the Horn of Africa, better or worse?
It's getting worse, unfortunately. We're seeing countries cracking down on journalists and freedom of expression at this time when they're also trying to control the spread of COVID-19. So we're seeing existing laws being used. So, for instance, false news laws to arrest journalists in Somalia who tried to report on COVID-19. Similarly, in Ethiopia, we recently had a journalist who was arrested allegedly for publishing false news and is now being charged under Ethiopia's disinformation law. At the same time, the worst jailer of journalists is in this region. The worst jailer of journalists in Sub-Saharan Africa is in this region, that's Eritrea. And Eritrea retains at least 16 journalists behind bars, as far as we can tell this year. Of course, this is incredibly worrying for us.
What about West Africa? Let's look at that now. Are there any countries where journalist freedom have improved, or are there countries in West Africa where things have gotten worse?
Recently, we reported on the assault of journalists in Ghana and in Liberia. We're also concerned about restrictions in Nigeria and how these might affect journalists' ability to cover COVID-19 well. And further, beyond that, we've also had pre-existing concerns about the use of laws to warrantless search laws and also the use of cybercrime laws in Nigeria against journalists.
Let's look farther down the continent. What do we see in the Great Lakes region, in DRC, in that part of Africa? What's going on with journalists there?
We're seeing in this region that there's a crackdown on the press that is associated with political calendars that we already had. So, for example, in Uganda and Burundi, upcoming elections have meant that security personnel have really cracked down on the press. Journalists have been harassed, assaulted while trying to report on the opposition. Media houses in Uganda have been shut down when they tried to have opposition leaders come in. And in Burundi, this is particularly a worrying year. We have 4 journalists who remain in jail. And on top of that, we're seeing the government trying to restrict which journalists can access information about COVID-19. Of course, all of this is a bad omen with the elections coming up, and we're really quite concerned about the ability of journalists to cover that election freely and safely. We're seeing a trend where there's sort of a conflation of official information with truth. So when you see journalists coming in and trying to report maybe or trying to put out information that perhaps hasn't been officially declared as the official truth, then we see a crackdown against them. or where they try to report critically on what's going on.
Thank you very much for joining us on The Voice of America.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young.